Hello, everyone. I am Janet Wong. I'm the Associate Artistic Director of New York Live Arts. Welcome to the first in-person Bill Chat since, you know what, yeah. We are also live streaming, so hello to the audience online. We would like to acknowledge that New York Live Arts is located in Lenape-Hoking, the homeland of the Lenape people. And we offer our gratitude and care of its land and its waters, and we would like to acknowledge and pay respect to the Lenape peoples and to all indigenous people, past, present, and coming in the future. So in case you don't know what Bill Chats is, it's, in a nutshell, Bill talking to fabulous people. My brains are not with me today. So that's what it is. And at the end of the conversation, we will have a Q&A, so there'll be a mic that's passed around, so please wait for the mic because we're streaming. And for those people joining us online, you can type your questions in the chat already, and our fabulous producing director, Kyle Mott, will collect the questions and share them with the speakers. And there's a delay online, so type them in any time. Yeah. So this event marks our very first public event of our new program, a new initiative, the Community of Scholars. What is it? You will find out. I will find out. Yeah. And this first cohort is led by our board member, Aimee Cox, and includes, behind me, Jasmine Johnson, probably not in the right order, never mind, Emil Wilbekin, and our board member also, Darnell L. We work our board members hard. Yes. So I will give a very brief introduction of Aimee. Sorry, Aimee, I apologize ahead of time because I'm going to compress your illustrious career into 2 sentences. There are QR codes there, look at that. And also outside, your digital program is in the email that you received. People online, it's going to be in the chat also, I believe. Yeah, so Aimee. Aimee Meredith Cox is jointly appointed in the departments of African American Studies and Anthropology at Yale. She's a dancer, choreographer, and award-winning writer. Her first monograph, Shapeshifters, Black Girls and the Choreography of Citizenship, won the 2017 Book Award from the Society for the Anthropology of North America and a 2016 Victor Turner Book Prize in Ethnographic Writing. So please join me in welcoming Aimee and the cohort.
Hello. It's so good to be here. I have to stand up, I'm sorry. Like, I am an embodied speaker, and if I don't stand up, I don't know what's gonna happen with these words. I also just wanna say how good it feels to be talking with real live bodies in front of me and to feel the energy. You know, we, in certain traditions, I think in every tradition that's on this stage, we believe in call and response. And in certain other traditions, we don't even need to have to use our voices to hear that call and response. You can feel it energetically. And I feel y'all, and I'm just feeling a little bit overwhelmed, but we have a lot to get through. So, words mean a lot to me, and so I hope you will forgive me or indulge me as I read some remarks. I want to be very specific with how I talk about these folks on this stage. So it is so good to be here finally. I feel as if this evening, or an evening like this, has been brewing for quite some time. So it was just about 1.5 years ago that I met with Bill T. Jones right here in the New York Live Arts offices on a day much like this, kind of cold and drizzly, but with this charge of expectation in the air, at least for me. I was excited about the possibility of joining the Live Arts Board and knew that that ask would largely depend on how Bill and I vibed, right? And if you know Bill, right? I was nervous. So, although I had been circling in a wide orbit around Bill before that day, for instance, I offered the introductory remarks when he was awarded the James Robert Brudner Memorial Prize at Yale, and I still have friends still dancing with Alvin Ailey American Dance Theater who named Bill as their all-time favorite choreographer to work with, even though Or maybe because he is so exacting, challenging, demanding you move from sincerity always. Despite this somewhat removed intimacy, I am a fan. And sometimes admiration can be a hindrance to real connection. So I was nervous. Within the first few minutes of our conversation, Bill said to me, I already have a board. What I need is a heart trust. Over the next hour, Bill would go on to explain to me what a heart trust meant to him and what distinguishes it from a brain trust. At some point during this explanation, I had a flashback to a moment with Bill I had forgotten. I was in my early 20s dancing with Ailey to Perpetually Broke, exhausted, doubting myself. The dance concert world was not the most kind or nurturing place for an overly sensitive Black girl. I hope that has changed. One of my dancer friends invited me to attend a repertory workshop Bill was holding on one of our rare days off. I don't recall the finer details of that day, only that I felt myself dancing, flying actually, in a way I hadn't been able to access ever before. This was, I believe, because when Bill watched me, he saw me. He was not observing, he was witnessing, and that difference lies in the narrow space between evaluating someone or taking them in. The distinction between looking to fix and looking to understand. So he didn't need to explain heart trust on that day in that office. I felt it at the center of my chest 2 decades prior in his presence under his watch. Today, we will explore the possibilities and the limitations of what heart trust can mean and how it birthed the idea of the community of scholars you see before you. This first cohort, which includes Darnell, Emil, and Jasmine, and myself. So this is how we'll flow. I'll introduce the scholars and then we'll move into conversation among ourselves for approximately 40 to 45 minutes, and then we'll open it up for dialogue with all of us in this space, or what is known as Q&A time, all right? Does that sound all right? Okay. So how about I start with introductions in alphabetical order by first name. I'll start with Darnell. And I will just say you can read all of Darnell's accolades and accomplishments in your program, about his work at Netflix as Vice President of Inclusion Strategy for Content and Marketing, about his award-winning memoir, No Ashes in the Fire, Coming of Age Black and Free in America. But what you won't find in your program, or if you Google Darnell, is how committed he was in 2009 to teaching Black feminist theory to high school-age young women in Newark, New Jersey. We traveled from Bed-Stuy to Newark once a week and planned the curriculum with these brilliant young women. We read Audre Lorde, Bell Hooks, Kimberly Crenshaw, Patricia Hill Collins, and James Baldwin, and if you don't know those names, please look them up, with these young women, and watched in awe as they translated what they were reading into their own poetry, choreography, songs. This fierce and loving commitment to the most vulnerable, and often therefore the most courageous and innovative members of our community, is what brings Darnell into this heart trust, over and above the very public measures of his success. Please welcome Darnell Moore. You may, Emil, you may likely already know, and if not, you can read about how Emil has burned down almost every obstacle in his path with his fiery investment in Black life and culture. Emil is, I often say, the culture. Emil is the founder of Native Son, an intergenerational movement, community platform created 4 years ago to inspire and empower Black, gay, queer men. Emil is also the former editor-in-chief of Giant and GiantMag.com and Vibe magazine. Who remembers Vibe? Y'all act like you don't, yep. What you won't be able to read anywhere about Emil is how he was the culture for many of the Black and brown kids at my high school. Emil and I attended Walnut Hills High School in Cincinnati, Ohio. And although he was several years ahead of me, he was legendary across grades and classes. Emil walked the halls of that school like the soles of his feet were dipped in gold. He had swagger before we had a name for swagger. And let me be clear, his presence was rooted in the kind of deep reserve of confidence that comes from being loved well and knowing that it is your right to walk with that love and give others permission to find the same for themselves. This is the energy and history Emil brings to this community, this heart trust. Welcome, Emil. Jasmine. As you will hear in a moment, Jasmine Johnson is one of the most thoughtful and stunningly brilliant people I have ever met. I hope you aren't tired of these origin stories because they're important. This is like a little segue. It's written down, so I won't go off too far. These aren't really anecdotes as much as signposts to the kind of integrity and personhood needed to be a heart trust, necessary for institutional change, essential in these fraught times. As we stand with our mouths wide open and eyes blinking for clarity as more and more of our rights are stripped from us each day, what we don't need is folks flexing their awards and credentials, right? We need minds cultivated by the bravery of hearts. We need connections that dissolve the performance of status in favor of relationships built in the spirit of mutual aid, trust, rebellion, disruption, collective transformation. But I digress. I met Jasmine at one of those academic conferences where everyone seems like an asshole. You all know what I'm talking about? Jasmine, whom I had heard of but hadn't met before, tapped me on my shoulder and pulled me aside to talk. We sat in conversation for hours. The conference faded in the background, and I was moved by how quickly one can find a friend of their mind and soul, especially in spaces that seem to thrive on false intimacies. Jasmine E Johnson is Assistant Professor of Africana Studies at University of Pennsylvania and visiting Assistant Professor of Dance at Princeton University. Please Google her and read her many, many, many brilliant articles on Black movement and diasporic travel. So this is our first cohort of community scholars. Can we give them a round of applause? Okay. I'll take my seat now. Okay, I'm getting hot. Okay. So you may have come across, I don't know, you may have, you can tell me, we can talk about it, but you may have come across various descriptions of Bill chats and what we might be talking about tonight. So you might have heard the language global curriculum or what it means to be a global citizen. In some posts you might have heard the question of what does it mean to create while Black? What does it mean to be an artist at all in these fraught times? How do we navigate critique? But these are not contradictory or sort of wrong descriptions of what we're gonna do tonight. I think these points speak to the capaciousness of our conversations over the past several months, right? And how much there is to consider, to talk through, and imagine. So, I think I'll start with you, Mr. Bill T. Jones. Could you tell us why a heart trust? And then from that heart trust, how we got here to the community of scholars and what that means to you. Why was that necessary?
Thank you very much. Yes. Oh, I have my own. Thank you very much. Wonderful introduction. I'm always amazed who you are when you open that mouth and the brilliant mind of yours is shown. This is perilous in a way to talk about the origin of this. And maybe there is something, which I'm sure Aimee will not let me dodge, talk about double consciousness. There's something about being a success in the white avant-garde. Let's name it. And that was not something that has been easy to do, to name it. Because one of the things I was taught, because my partner was a Jewish Italian man, our partner in life and in choreography, and we were like gangbusters trying to break down walls that we didn't know were actually there. When Arnie passed away, I was committed to keeping the company. The company was doing well, and we were invited to merge with the legendary Dance Theater Workshop. That happened. It had its own challenges, which I won't go into tonight unless you want to, but I don't think it's so productive. I do know there was a moment when at an early board meeting when I turned to this fledgling group that it was not yet merged and says, is this a white organization? Now, that was an important moment because, first of all, important for me to say it and important for the board to actually hear it. There was only at that point one Black member on the board, and that was David Thompson. So people had their responses. We did the merger. It was not a pleasant couple of years. I felt like an interloper. And I had this feeling, as you're an interloper, because people say you've won 2 Tony Awards, you've been out in the world, you're corrupted. And there was still this feeling that the avant-garde was something that was above commerce, outside of commerce. The word populism used to be said with a kind of a sniff. And I thought, what does that really mean to me? When we were forming New York Live Arts, I had the feeling sometimes that some of the pushback that I was getting was not so much that my aesthetic was different from what the, quote, downtown was. I felt that I had helped build the downtown. My first concerts were in this space in 1977. So wasn't I card-carrying member? But there was something else, I thought. And I wondered if it had to do with race. I wonder if it had something to do with the fact that I could not name another organization, downtown organization, that was led by a black person. So that was sobering, not new, but it was sobering and in some ways angering. And the anger came from 2 directions. You are alone, Bill, because you have made yourself alone. You don't really know how to be in a black community. So stop complaining that they're not here. You have work to do. Okay, even though I have done pieces called The Last Supper at Uncle Tom's Cabin, I have done a lot of works where on stage I really spoke as a black man. I always felt that I was not really in a black world. So do something about it. As the board was growing, and it's a wonderful board, we, with Kim Cullen as my handy guide and helping me she would ask me, where do you want to go, Bill? And I said, I want to go there, and Kim would find a way to do that. And I said that I felt lonely still, and I wanted people around me who I didn't have to use a shorthand, or I could use a shorthand to express certain feelings. Form was a calling card. But could you do form and at the same time do biography in the work? And the biography would always have a streak of pain in it. Oh, that's political work. Oh, political? That's the poetry of my life. Now we understand that. Now we understand that. I was saddled with, identity politics. What do you mean identity politics? Because I speak as a black person, that means my identity is the most important thing? Why do I need people around me who understand that that's the way I roll? Why at moments of ecstasy do I turn to my mother's spirituals? Why do I quote, and at the drop of a hat, people will say, Gayle King said to me, Bill, we didn't know you were going to take us to church. What does that mean, take you to church? I thought that is when you get most honest, most real. I said, I need people around me who get this. And the people who were there, they were embracing me, literally taking money out of their pocket, laying it on the table. But I wanted some people who could actually understand what it meant to be double conscious. And so we found board members. Aimee brought Darnell. And we began to, and maybe Kim, you'll speak about this later, we did a reading group. COVID brought many wonderful things, terrible things, but wonderful thing. We had a Saturday morning reading group. Kim and I, were very moved that Darren Walker at the Ford Foundation was so taken with Isabel Wilkerson's cast. I don't know if you've read the book. So we would be reading that book every week, and I invited board members, others, because Kim and I were going to read it together, but I said this is a way to build a bridge with my staff members, and we were very proud that we were attracting powerful people of color on the staff, and I thought I needed to know them more. That was one objective, but also to have a mixed group of people in terms of race and in terms of class, talking about caste. If any of you know the book, it's some very strong claims there that in American society, the mud sill, and if you know the metaphor of a building, the mud sill is the lowest part of the foundation, and it is literally the sill on which everything sits. In her thesis, black people in this country have always been the mud sill. So reading that book, it led me to understand that there was a lot of conversation that we could be having. So maybe, Bill, how do you find a way to extend this conversation, and who would be there with you who could actually help support the conversation? That was one very important impulse. Intellectually, how do we talk about the honesty of what America is? Now, questions like, what is blackness in the avant-garde? Now, is the avant-garde like, what was that old John Lennon song, a working class hero is so hard to be? And he talks about being classless and free. This was a vanity of the rock music world, that they were classless and free. Never mind, no color. They just, like it took the Guerrilla Girls to remind the art world that there was a problem with women's bodies. Well, I think the others just took it for granted that, well, you guys are cool. If you're here with us, then you're down. If you're at the kitchen, if you're at Pitts 122, if you're the black person there, we have no problem. You're here. But something was wrong about it. So how can we find a group of people who can actually be an intellectual bastion for me? And so I say heart space and brain trust at the same time. They have to be people who have some vision, some understanding. Wonderful, the head of our department of public relations, Tyler, and Janet Wong, we were getting ready to do, yet again, Black History Month. And I don't know who said, hey, you know, we don't do Black History Month. Every month is Black History Month. So, oh, that's quite a claim, is it? In the avant-garde, particularly at that time, since we are trying to do the history of what has been done, this place was founded in 1968, correct? I said, well, why can't we have a group of people who could every month do the archaeology and find out who was making the most progressive work in the body-based community in the late 60s, in the 70s. So we need intellectuals. We need historians. We need those sort of people to be a kind of a brain trust. And wouldn't it be great if Bill, at the same token, could have people who were a heart trust as well, people he could hang with. And I don't know, this is what I mean about it's so difficult to say this, because every time I say what I want from black people, it sounds like what I'm not getting from white people. It's true, but it ain't true. Therefore, who do you hang with? Who can you share a joke? I mean, did you know the shade that she was throwing tonight, right? You know, and it's sort of like, it's kind of like a joke. It's a joke, it's got its barbs, but there's a way of talking and all. And I want more of it. I want more of it. I remember that after that board meeting where I asked to people, is this a white organization? There was a person who used to work here, and a lot of people used to work here, who was in tears. You don't want me. I get the feeling you don't want me. You don't want what I have. And I felt for her, but I didn't know what to do with that. So here we are now. This group is to make Bill feel that he has people around him who know, as my sister Vanessa said, I want people who know my name. I told Jesus, be all right if you change my name. Now, in the black church, change my name is myself, my essence. I want to, and you would go to Jesus to change your name. I'm not going to Jesus. I would like to have a community of people who know my name. And people who know where the bodies are buried. People who know the history, that you can present to me every month, if need be, some unsung person of color who has been doing important, innovative work in the body-based community for a long time. Let's bring that forward, not to supplement, not to replace anything else, but to actually enrich what we mean by the downtown avant-garde community. And we do not intend to stay downtown. We are trying to build a bridge to the commercial theater. Why the commercial theater? Because quite frankly, that's where most of the black people that I know are. And I think that there might be a chance of what we do here could actually find expression in a world that has access to more audiences of color. Now, how have I done? Is that enough?
It's a lot.
That's enough.
And it's great. It's beautiful.
Yeah.
And so I'm wondering if we could think with you around so many different things. I just stopped taking notes. I was just like, I'll just listen with my heart. And so I think the first thing that I would like us to think with as a community is, you know, your desire for this heart trust started from a place of loneliness, if I can say that, and a place of deep need, even though you have been making work for decades and decades. And I'm wondering if we can kind of dig a little bit deeper, all of us, with that initial impulse as a creator. We are all different. We're all creators, right? The impulse to need someone or a group of people who know your name, and how that very human, personal desire then translates into wanting a black organization or thinking about naming an organization as black. And I think we can all think about that in the realms that we work in, that desire to have community. And I'm gonna turn to you, Jasmine, because I'd love for you to speak a bit about this concept of conferral, that you bring up this concept of black conferral. And I think even if we, in this room, name ourselves as black folks, we might not necessarily know what that means, or it means something different for each of us in different times in our lives. But if we could speak to sort of the personal and the larger social dimensions of needing that space of black conferral and what it does beyond the obvious, and especially in these times.
Absolutely. I mean, I think in many ways the evocation of double consciousness is something that's really central here, that thinking about the doubleness of it being both gift and curse. So on the one hand, black folks historically become incredibly literate in the way, how far other people understand them from being from humanity, while they also understand quite deeply this incredibly capacious vocabulary around black humanity that is, in some ways that's a burden because it's not recognized. In other ways, that opacity is quite radical and allows for a different kind of possibility of black being that in some ways is permitted because black folks being together can often be a hush harbor. So there's a hush harbor.
A hush harbor.
So there feels to me something really important, and I think we all know that, you know, and we talked a little bit about this together in our last meeting, but that in many ways hypervisibility can be the kind of twin of invisibility. And there is something about being so seen that people can mistake that for being understood. And I think that is something that we have to hold a lot of caution around. So the gift of kind of black togetherness is, first of all, I want to say not necessarily and always a romance. I want to be really clear about that, right? And there seems to me also this potential to be able to speak without translation, to be able to not just be seen, but to be deeply understood, and to be invited into a black expansiveness that doesn't require actually hypervisibility, or that doesn't require a certain kind of performance of belonging, when sometimes the ticket of belonging is actually a certain kind of distance from presumed ideas around blackness, but that allows a certain kind of black right nowness that feels incredibly important. And I think some of the gifts of the work that we've been able to do, work, ellipses, right? Like fill in the blank for that word, But the conversations that we've had allowed for such a kind of honest and transparent series of conversations around this moment being absolutely predicated on these longer histories that you index, Bill, and that you have made in many ways. And the kinds of intimacy between inclusion and exclusion, folks' proximity, understanding that maybe as intimacy in ways that are not always the case, I think, for all of us. Yeah. And so there's something just beautiful, I think, about this being together that allows for a shorthand, sure, and also a rigor. I think a rigor and a sober wrestling with history in order to better understand the kind of complexity of the now.
Now, I wonder if maybe, because you've been very elegant when you say hypervisibility, how can a person, when we did Deep Blue Sea at the Armory this year, it really angered me. They had all these, my collaborator Liz Diller, one of the visionaries, and they Bill T. Jones, one of the most written about artists, and So that's my claim, is that I've been written about? And I mean, you couldn't find any other way to talk about why I might be valid? I just been written about a lot. So someone might say, look, man, you've been written about so much. What you're complaining about? So that's what you mean by hypervisibility.
Yes.
So and she just gave me that word, hypervisibility. Yeah.
Yeah, and then people think they know you. I think that's.
Oh, yes, people think they know you.
Because they see you in a very public way. Yeah, and so then when you act out of turn, right, or you create a piece that's out of character, right, your public character, then there's a price to be paid for that.
Are you asking for that anecdote?
If you want to offer it, but I also want to, maybe we'll come back to that, okay?
All right.
Emil,
this one's fresh off the presses, so we'll
yeah, there we go. So for me, what has been really amazing about being in the community of scholars is to be sitting at Bill's knee and to be able to have access to someone that had a very profound impact on how I view art and culture and dance. Moving to New York, I wrote about it on Instagram as a very young journalist and editor. And, you know, knowing your work, seeing you at TED, being impacted by your work, and then leading or serving, I prefer more than leading, an organization that is focused on Black, gay, and queer men. And so when people want to know your name, you want people to know your name. I want people to know your name. And I want people to know your impact. I was so delighted to see the Alvin Ailey documentary and to see what you and George Faison said about Mr. Ailey and described him in ways that we don't really think about, right? The burden that he had to carry as a Black gay man, his vision of dance as activism because he wasn't on the front line, and then how he engaged with you, it's very different from how he engaged with George. And I loved how you talked about, he was like, don't rough up my dancers.
Don't hurt my boys, Bill, he said.
Exactly. But that legacy for all of us, especially right now, when we need to know people's names and need to know what people are bringing to the party, I think that visibility is actually very important. But it's important that you tell the story, right? And that you surround yourself with people who are able to amplify your story.
Now, is that why we have an identity besotted era now? And is that a good thing? Or is it, because that's often laid on my doorstep. You were one of the people that led a generation of people to be so obsessed with their identity, their trans identity, their identity as women, their identity as Asian, their identities as physically different, so on. Is it? Well, we should talk about it. Is it too much? Has it gone too far?
Y'all should see our conversations like not on a stage. Because that would have been like, that point right there would have sparked a whole thing.
And they pushed back.
You saw what I was just doing over here, like, because I kept thinking the entire time, well, who is the we that we're referring to? We've always been obsessed with identity in this country. The identity of majoritarian groups, right? Whiteness exists. even in its supposed invisibility. You know, when we talk about the avant-garde, there's always there's a modifier sitting in front of the avant-garde that we never named. White avant-garde, right? When we think about a variety of I mean, come on, this is the United States of America. We are an identity-based country that has used identities to proffer power, to create hierarchies, and people have benefited off of those identities. So let's just get away from this idea that identity-based politics, which have been used by people in power forever, are a bad thing. That said, I'm thinking back to your point about wanting people to know your name, and it was interesting. I told Bill that there's something really powerful and beautiful about Bill creating for someone's who may not have been an audience in his head. And I talk about as a creator, I always say, I always go to the page when I'm writing with an imaginary audience in my head. Often it's a little black boy with kinky hair, and I'm always looking at the back of his head. And even if I wasn't in the audience in your head, I still felt the impact of your creation. I told him, before I was on the board, before we met, I knew his name. I knew his name. Your work, your presence in the world, whether you created or not, right? Things that I had come in contact with, is part of a genealogy of my livelihood as a black queer person in this world. I know your name. But I also, I don't know, I'm thinking too about the second point that you raised about we were wrestling with sort of what are the stakes are naming an organization black? And we can talk about what a black organization is, but I want to just talk about the conferral or what the process of naming is meant to do. To name, you asking a question about is this a black organization or a white organization, right? You're trying to get at what are the sort of political, the foundational politics, the commitments, who's centered in the imaginary of the people who call themselves New York Live Arts as worthy of being seen, as worthy of having art created in response to. And to ask that question is a powerful one, and it's a right now question to ask. Who's the audience in our, who's existing in our freedom dream at the center of it? Who's absent, who's not? Who are we creating for? Who matters? Who do we give a fuck about at the end of the day? And I think what you're asking is, by naming this, whether it's a black organization or a black-led organization, and sorry for sweating, this is what you get when you wear like faux mink coat sweaters on the thing, is that in that estimation, we have to ask the question, where does blackness and black people figure in it? Not just for your art making, but for this organization. And that's a worthy question to be asked. Because to assume that everybody is coming to the table with that commitment is to assume a mistruth.
Well, you know, of course, and I think that this is a moment of truth-telling, it is really hard to get an integrated audience here. Now, Janet, who is my associate, as others have said before, the audiences come depending on who the artist is being presented. Now, is that something in the future? I would love to have a robust, mixed audience coming no matter what, because they trust us. Right now, I don't know if that's always the case. So that is very important right now, understanding who do I make the work for? And I think I have to come out and say, I thought to be a good modern artist was to be alienated. And that who are you making the work for? Are you making it for she who shall not be named, who used to be the head writer at the New Yorker? Are you making it for Anna Kisselgoff? Are you making it for, who is it being made for? See, that's what I thought, oh, it's about, you're aiming for the history books. So what's going to get you in the history books? What is your, it irritates my husband, who is a Frenchman, who says New York is so concerned with your brand. You know, are you a minimalist? Are you an expressionist? What is your lineage? How do you get in the history books? I am in the history books, but for identity politics. AIDS, gay, right? Can I get in the history books having done important work that integrates various forms? Can I get in the history books? You've really put your finger on something. Who do you make your work for?
And I just say quickly too that, when I think about, some people say Darnell's a black writer, and they would say that if the primary concern of some of the things that I write are black people. And I'm like, I've never seen a category for like white writers. So I am of the believer that in striving for specificity in one's art, that is, if I decide to write a book that is exploring, let's say, a predominantly black city called Camden, New Jersey, within a cultural milieu that is sort of like black, right? That somehow has to be modified by this term black. And I'm happy with that. I'm fine with that. But if I were decided to write a book, I don't know, about the downtown arts, avant-garde, somehow that doesn't
be great. I'd love to read it.
The claims on that. Do you understand what I'm trying to say here? So I think so much of the questions that you're asking are riddled, are shaped by these unspoken entanglements and this sort of identity politics and sort of the negativity around that is only ever sort of hearkened when we're talking about like the folk for whom are situated on the underside of the boots of power. Soon as it becomes black art, it's like identity politics. Bill done does some identity politics. But if you created this other thing that may not have sort of centered the experience of non-white, non-male, non-straight, non-able-bodied people, all of a sudden it becomes this other thing that's constant, like that becomes center of debate. So I don't know if, to the thing that we wrestle with, like this point about whether or not an organization is black-led or let's call it a black organization, I think my question is, does that organization care about the concerns of black people? And if so, how is that expressed through the work that it does?
And I would love at one point my associate artistic director, who is a Chinese woman, I wonder what she, who is the person who does a lot of our programming, thinks about what you just said. Because is her mandate to care about black people or to care about a certain, what should an organization like ours, forward-thinking, progressive, who should we be caring about?
I mean, as you're having this conversation, what strikes me is the language we're using and how much of it does not apply to black folks, right? Yep. The idea of branding, the idea of critique, so much of what we are, sort of where we find ourselves in these spheres of evaluation and assessment don't apply to us, and yet we wear them with so much weight. Right? When you think about branding, whenever I hear that word branding in the context of folks who have a history of being bought and sold, right? To brand yourself. And when we talk about, the modifier, sort of the universal whiteness that is never marked, right? The unmarked category of whiteness. And to, in some ways, this is a question, to settle into the fact that we are marked. We are marked, right? And to kind of walk away from the preoccupation with being called a black artist or a black writer or a black professor or a black whatever, and just do your thing, and do your thing with the integrity of knowing why you're doing it and who it's for. Even if you can look out into the audience and see they're not coming yet. Right? They're not here yet, but there still is that.
They being.
If you're talking about a black audience, right? Yeah. If you're talking about or a more diverse audience, but that cannot change the sort of the baseline motivation to create a certain type of work for a certain community. But I think where we get into a quagmire, where we sort of can't think our way out of it or make our way or create our way out of it, is when we allow ourselves to be defined by these terms that have nothing to do with our history or experience, right? Even I think about, and so I'm gonna bring up the question of critique. I think it's a powerful one for you throughout history, right? How your work has been assessed and evaluated, how you've been critiqued. And I wonder if we can do a little healing on this stage tonight. Because what I would say is these critiques and the language that has been used to talk about your work has nothing to do with an understanding of your history, your motivations, your investments as an artist. And I just wonder how we think about that, navigating critique, because critique is directly tied to our audience. It's directly tied to these questions of who is at the back of our head when we're writing, when we're making dance, even when we don't want it to be the case, it is the case. And I would venture that for so many of us, we have spent lifetimes getting that white supremacist critique, right? That the overarching critique. And we have to understand that these folks who are coming for you are directly sort of a part of that genealogy.
But is it fair at this point for me to ask, and in you in particular, what is the purpose of critique in the creative process? Do you feel there should be people who have standards, point of view, that are allowed to really let fly at you no matter what your gender or your race is? And is it valid? So what is critique for? Never mind white people critiquing black artists.
Critique should be to make us all better, right? If it's an honest critique. If it's an honest critique, right? And if we're talking, for example, about an artist's work and we're talking about form, right? And we're talking about the whatever the creative realm is, if we're talking about dance or writing, if there is a sort of, and this is where I'm gonna have to stop myself, I don't think is it in an objective critique. There's no objective critique. I was about to say, if it adheres to these standards, then I have to stop myself because the standards don't always apply to us or don't necessarily apply to us. So I wonder if we could think about seeking out our critics, right?
I'm sorry,
seeking out critics, right? Seeking out that honest critique. And what I mean by that is trusting that you can find someone who'll be honest enough with you, right? And maybe it's not gonna be in a public forum, but who understands your heart and what you're trying to do, right? There's certain critiques that I don't think we should accept, because they come from a place that doesn't even value us as human beings. So how could you understand what I'm trying to say? You know, and so I wonder if we re-engage our relationship to criticism, if we re-engage our relationship or reevaluate how we think about, and this goes back to the heart trust. This is why you need folks around you who can be honest, who are smart enough to tell you what something is or what it isn't, but can understand your name and know your name. I think that's what we're talking. I mean, all of this is connected, right? And so critique is important. Critique is powerful, but I think less and less is the case that it's honest, right? That it comes from a place of deep understanding.
I just want to, I'm an amen corner over here, but I just wanted to add, maybe in the spirit also of, you know, being really careful to not romanticize Black gathering, that when we're thinking about histories of critique, I also want to think about, and you've mentioned so many examples across our time talking together, of like long genealogies of maybe elder Black choreographers who came before you deciding whether or not what you were doing was Black, or deciding whether or not you deserved access to something else. So I offer that because I want to just problematize, like trouble the waters a little bit, right? That there is something about, you know, the power of critique and these long histories of Black misrecognition. But I think that there's also, and this is connected to our conversation around these institutions and access to power, right? That like thinking in a gospel of scarcity, that I think can also influence how we decide, or to what terms we decide to include each other. And I offer this because you've shared so many stories and anecdotes about different engagement with people who you adore and respect, right? So that at least how you've described it, never thrown anybody away, and also are carrying, I think, these other long genealogies, right, of Black judgment as well. Yeah. And so I want us to talk about that, right? That like, why isn't the avant-garde understood by Black folks, right? This dichotomy between pedestrian dancing and the rhythmic or virtuosic. All of these kinds of false dichotomies that I think do sometimes over-determine or over-rely on ideas of authentic Blackness, which do us no favors.
Wonderfully said, huh? Yeah.
And I would also add that critique is inherently biased, right? Critique is really one person's perspective and what influences that perspective. And so I think that we have to take that into consideration as well. And so as you were talking, Aimee, I thought about the difference of real talk, which would come from your heart trust and your brain trust, versus critique, right? Because one's coming with love and one's coming with this is my perspective. And then to Jasmine's point, because of white supremacy and the power structure, that's already a double bias, right? Because this is what I see critically and artistically, and this is my take on it, and I'm going to either love it or hate it, basically. There's not a lot of middle ground. And then where does that land from a media industry that is led mostly by white folks, right? Mostly by white men. And so that is going to be a stilted perspective.
Tell me, this is Ava, my black sister, who is a writer, who actually curates a program at Gibney. Ava, you here tonight? This is very hurtful. Because what I'm always saying for years is, why is there not a person of color, a black critic, dance critic, at the New York Times? So someone told me, why does that matter? If they're a good critic, they're a good critic. Why does it matter to me? And I only know of, I think Charmaine does some criticism, is that true? And then there's Ava. Who else, Tyler? Who else is black that is a critic? Yeah, sadly not. Right, so you understand my dilemma, right? So, and I feel peevish and small when I want somebody to, quote, be black who is looking at the work. Are you not strong enough to stand up to criticism from anybody? What's wrong with you? See, that's your problem. You're weak. You depend on these extraneous pillars of judgment. Your work should be so strong that you don't really care who is looking at it. And then, so we end up here tonight talking about, so for me to accept the need of black critique, I must accept the need of being first a black artist rather than an artist. Now that's a dirty pool to step into. So what are you want? And I thought, I'm a badass. I want to be with James Joyce, James Baldwin. I want to be with, look at the 20th century. I want my work to be like John Coltrane, at the same time, like Morton Feldman, like John Cage. I want to be with all of them. Now, and the demands that we're making tonight, do I get excluded from that club? And am I excluding myself?
I mean, until you added James Baldwin at the end of that list, I'm just looking at the time, and I do want to answer that question. But
maybe we don't need to answer
well,
it.
I think what we could, I mean, there's a lot that we've sort of thrown into the pot, right? We've been talking about what does it mean to even name something black, a black organization, how fraught that is, how we get outside of these binaries of black and white, how we think beyond that. What is our charge as creators? What does it mean to come together in intimate black space?
What does it mean
for someone to know your name? What does it mean to be free?
What does it mean to be really free?
What does it mean to be really free? So there's a lot, and this is not something, these aren't things that we're going to untangle tonight, but I wonder if we could reflect a little bit on our time together, all too brief, as community of scholars, as a community, and what each of you see as what is next? What is the future? Where do we go from here? Do we keep having these conversations? What is the action? What is the reflection? What do you want to leave us with as we think about bringing more people into this community?
Yeah, I first want to just appreciate you. Oh, I'm glad I get to do this in public. Just for being.
Thank you for that.
And, you know, I appreciated our time together because one needs to know really the stakes of the game.
Stakes of the game? What do you mean?
The stakes of the game. the stakes of the game, the stakes of the power structure, how this game is played. When you exist within a matrix of power dynamics, of power differentials, of white supremacy, of heteronormativity, of all these things, right? Like, to be a black man in love with other men who has been very public about his love, about HIV, about pain, about life, about livability, is to be someone who has existed within a matrix of oppression, a matrix of power, of access, of various points of access. And I think often, like, the way hearing you talk about sort of appearing in this space as like Bill T. Jones, who's often seen as Bill T. Jones stripped away from a deeply contextual life, has been powerful to witness. You go into that deep context. And even more powerful, and when I talked about the game, I'm using a metaphor here, or a way to get at the way that we live our lives as people who are embattled in a lot of different ways, and not just embattled, but who are freed in a lot of different ways because of the various forces that we have to war against. But to go back to the point I was making, in order to be free from that, one needs to know what they need to be free from. Mm-hmm. And that's been what this, I think, our shared investigation has been about.
But Darnell, I hear this person, she keeps pushing back in the center of the conversation. Do not put your, don't romanticize your race. And I think, I don't want to speak for you, because I'm trying to understand how to love what you're saying. And I have been out in front. Mm-hmm. Nobody threw down about HIV, AIDS as Arnie Zane and I did. Mm-hmm. It was public. Yep. Arnie Zane and I kissed full mouth on the stage at the Brooklyn Academy of Music in 1983. And then the curator of Merce Cunningham's group, and Merce Cunningham, I'm a big fan of Merce Cunningham, the curator there, David Vaughn, said to someone who said, why did they have to rub our noses in it, right? So I know those things, but now I want their respect. I don't want them to say, oh, that's, his life's been so hard only. That may be true, but I want their respect. Now that's the hard point, and I think it's this is my sickness. I think it's my failing. If I had not created a dance that's going to like knock them out aesthetically, right? Then knock them out, then I have failed. So,
no.
Well, no, okay, but you understand.
Yes.
This is a sick
yes
artist.
And no.
Okay. You're not giving me any slack.
No.
Do you mind getting my phone out of there? Because there's a question from that I want to ask. Yes, please. You're not going to give me any slack. Huh?
No, of course not. And I think it goes back to what Aimee said, right? Like, whose affirmation, whose love, whose sort of like approval are we aiming for? And I ask you this all the time. The failure is not in you needing somebody's respect. The failure is the fact that we exist within spaces, institutions, a world that has predetermined in so many ways whose approval we ought to seek and who gets to decide whether, our not only the works that we create, but our very existence ought to be celebrated. That's the game. So freedom for me is freeing myself up from having to wait on any white critic, any critic.
Any critic?
I love when black critics say nice things. I also have had experience where, I tell this one quick story where I had a lawyer who was reviewing my memoir for the publisher. So the identifiers, a white woman from Texas. I had a whole idea of who this white woman was based off of those two things. She's like, I'm a white woman from Texas, I read your book. And this book is all about black people in Canada. I'm like, and she's like, I loved it, and it spoke to me in so many ways. And I was like, how? And I literally said to her, Marlon knows this, because I told him, I'm like, you weren't in my head when I wrote it. And she said, but I connected, you wrote about human experiences. Mm-hmm. This is what I was trying to get at. Specificity is an entry point to universality. White people have been doing that forever. We got, as black people, invited into the specificity of white experience and was taught to understand love, pain, family, all things through that specific experience, and nobody ever raised a bat about it. So you therefore should never have to be on the other side waiting for something in a game that was already sort of set up for who's going to win from the start of it, is what I'm trying to say. That's my love to you.
No, thank you. Yeah. Aimee, in the spirit of moving forward, there's a question that I asked a member of my staff, and this staff member wrote, here's my question. We are swimming in so much information, real, fake, feelings versus facts, opinions, biases. Oh, shoot, I just lost it now, going back. Sorry. Much information, real, fake, feelings versus fact, opinions, biases, echo chambers. Information that comes to us via various media and often determined and altered by the medium itself. How can one receive information, understand its meaning and consequences? And I think I would say that's a question from the audience. And is that something that we want to, how do we, no matter what our race or gender, how are we dealing with this information besotted environment that we're in right now?
Well, Jasmine answered better earlier.
It was the most quick answer ever, which was read.
Read.
But I think not reading Twitter feeds. I think reading history. I think also being quiet and listening to elders. I think being rigorous in those practices are getting increasingly atrophied in a way that I find to be really disturbing. Deep study. Yeah, deep study. Study that is not quick, study that does not do the work for you, study that requires you going to the original instead of inheriting the intervention. Deep study, or reposting. And that's not, I don't mean to be like flippant or shady around these new modes of technology that allow us for an incredible kind of access and also different kinds of platforms to be able to meaningfully organize, right? So it's not one or the other here. And I'm not pining so much or being nostalgic more than I am just wanting, I think in many ways, being somebody who is very invested in teaching, the importance of sitting and holding time to be able to read, right? And to watch. I'm thinking about like an experience that I had with a very brilliant MFA student who has given permission for me to communicate this story, but like, it was like, Prof. J, I'm so excited to do this piece, thinking about like working with terminally ill folks and interviewing them, and it just hasn't been done before. And I'm like, well, and then they did the work, right? And then they were able to dive deep. But it's that sometimes I think we can really imagine ourselves brand new. And not standing on it, on anyone's shoulders. So I mean that both in terms of like, I mean reading in a very capacious way. I think reading art, I think being a student of it, I think, keeps you from, I was saying before, right? What keeps you from falling over from blowing in the wind is being rooted. And I think we just need a little bit more of that rootedness.
In spaces like this. You need to be in community. You have to be in community.
In community.
In community, and preferably intergenerational community. And to be able to be quiet. I think, one thing I will bring up, the wisdom of the elders, but also this sort of deep, inherent embodied wisdom that we have that we don't listen to because, I'll just speak for myself, that we so often find ways to not feel those things, right? There's so much knowledge that we hold in our bodies. So these practices that are about deep connection and contact, whether it's through a community like this, whether it's just sitting around the table and looking into each other's eyes and having conversation, and even if you don't have access to the kinds of sort of that knowledge that we might think of that happens in a university, you don't need, our parents, our grandparents didn't need that, but what they did have, a lot of them, was community, right? And that ability to say, I don't understand this, what do you think? This feels off to me, can you help me? Right, a community of thinkers which is different than a community of academics.
So are you saying put down the cell phones?
No, I mean, I'm just saying, like, we have to be more intentional about how we're taking in information always, right? How we're consuming, I'll just say how we're consuming everything. And I think the pace at which we live our lives prevents us from slowing down and realizing how much we are taking in our bodies, right, through our senses, right, and how it's impacting us. So I wouldn't necessarily say we know, Jasmine just stated beautifully the ways that technology does work for us and does bring us together and helps us mobilize in all of these ways, but just like anything that we become addicted to that creates a barrier between us and the truth, a barrier between us and reality, a barrier between us and feeling, is something that we have to reckon with and find balance within.
So from my media perspective, Aimee, I would say be judicious and diligent with research and study. And if you want to do a deep dive into something, really go deep, right? Really read and do great research, right? And learning. And one of the things, I want to bring it back to the community of scholars, which was a blessing for me in this experience. As much as I knew about Bill T. Jones coming in, it was great for Bill to say, I would like you all to read this. I want you to watch this video. I've just read this. Can we all read this? And then can we talk about it? And so I do agree with you about being in community with folks and sharing information. You can then find an elevated conversation, a deeper conversation. You can agree to disagree. And I think that's super important versus just taking whatever is said and not considering the source.
What we call here participation in the world of ideas.
There you go.
Yeah.
I'm wondering if we might open it up.
I was hoping
And Tyler, I don't know, Tyler has all the answers. Tyler, how are we doing Q&A? Are we just asking folks to step up?
Yeah, Paulina will come over with a mic if you can just wait to ask her question when she...
Okay, so we should just look for raised hands if anyone has a question or comment. We'd love to be in conversation with y'all. Yes.
I see two hands.
Two hands up front. Jana and Toya.
Hi, just really beautiful words, thoughts, everything. Just making me think about how we, and by we I mean Black people, taking responsibility for our own unlearning and the ways that we also gatekeep and gatekeep everything all the time. And naming that, is problematic, right? That we do that. We do that a lot, and we do it with precision. And it causes harm. And I wonder, for each of you, how you've handled your own unlearning. It's a lot to contribute, try to heal, be servant to the communities, also create great art, and unlearn so that you don't cause harm. How you do it?
Yeah, it's a beautiful question. I really deeply respect it because one thing I always say, I'm mindful that crabs fight each other so hard when they're in a barrel because the barrel exists. And so what that means for me, yes, if black folks go into battle with each other, particularly as it relates to gatekeeping, is because we also exist within a structure that has made that possible, which is not to exonerate us from any accountability or responsibility. We need to own that. But I always say, I think that, and I repeat this everywhere I go, but I think we're really good at, and all of us, well, let me use an I statement. I've been really good at naming whose feet are are situated on my neck. Not really good at naming the necks that my feet are on. And if I'm honest, if we are honest, I think that's where we've been in sort of, let's call it sort of leftist, radical, whatever word you want to use, politics. Really good at naming and the fingers that pointed out. I can point my finger at all the ways I'm oppressed, and the ways that I'm harmed. Not good at taking a look at and being honest with and reckoning with the necks that my feet are situated on. And the honest reality is all of us got our feet on somebody else's neck. And the reason why it's hard to name that is because once you realize your feet is on somebody's neck, you got to move them bad boys off. You got to reckon with your power or what you're going to give up. And who the hell wants to give up anything in a world that told you got to have it all? So I think that's the way I work. I do. Like look, I done did all the study about all the shit I got to work through and the ways that I'm oppressed. I've been focusing at this stage of my life on that second part. Mm-hmm. Who are you in the world? Yes, you're a black, queer, able-bodied person, but let's talk about your class access, your access to resources. Let's talk about where you decide to live and who you decide to live around. Let's talk about the fact that you can move around without, the type of access sort of, talk about your privileges, D. Your access points. This, to me, is how we get free. So I don't know. That's my sort of entry point into what I'm calling sort of my own deliverance and unlearning. And unlearning is a work. It is a radical work, right? Not only the unlearning about, the ways that we've taught to sort of hate ourselves, but the ways that we've been taught to hate each other. And that work happens and should happen every day.
My husband said to me in Philadelphia, we looked at each other and said, we like gentrified spaces.
Real.
Oh, wow. Mm-hmm. We like gentrified spaces. And we have difficulty looking at poor people.
Yeah.
There's a lot of homeless people in Philly.
Yep.
A lot of homeless people. So that is baby steps toward unlearning. Now, what am I going to do about the fact that I am comfortable in gentrified spaces, mm-hmm. and I am uncomfortable with people who are dying in front of me for want? So what my next step? My next step, I will stop right there.
Mm-hmm. Real.
Mm-hmm. I'll just say really, really quickly that there's no arrival for me, at least. And I'll just say that one of the huge things that I have to constantly put pressure on myself to continue to unlearn, I think particularly being in a job that is so deeply hierarchical. And to be honest, that I'm invested in some ways in that hierarchy.
Yep.
To just be honest and sober about that, right? And what's required of that, what that means for me and my relationship to my colleagues, and also how to keep tender with the work.
Yeah.
So one of the things that I'm constantly trying to hold is that the work that we do is not synonymous with the places where we work, right. And to create that necessary distance so that I don't feel like a representative for an institution. I feel like a close listener to the Black folks that I write for and about.
There was another question. Yes.
Thank you, all of you, for such a wonderful, nuanced conversation. Sorry, I have to stand up too. And I had a couple of two thoughts or two areas I'd like to hear us talk more about. Is when you were asking repeatedly, who are we doing this work for? And that kind of anxiety that we have about that, when we get, and I just, I was thinking, what does it do when we think about the work that we make? Because I write about dance and I research dance, and to think about, it multi-signifying, right? Like we always have to be talking to white folks in some level. So the clever ways that the work that you do and other people that's multi-registered, you know, so it can do a lot of different kind of work at the same time. I don't know, just thinking that's what, when I see your work, that's what I, you know, can think of. And the other thing is community and how we can think about the communities that we make, like how do we make them? Because it's like a verb, right? Community, like we have to make it. And it seems like we're involved in a lot of very complex communities. Like it's not just one community that we can kind of lean on. So maybe you guys could talk a little bit more about community too. Thank you.
Thank you, Jana.
Thank you very much.
I think a lot about communities that are nestled within other communities, and I think a lot of us on the stage have spent a lot of time in predominantly white institutions. Toya knows what I'm talking about. and it resonates really strongly with me, a lot of what Darnell said about recognizing whose neck you're standing on. And I think that's a really difficult work because if we're honest, like Jasmine was just very honest, we are invested, right? We do like nice things in our neighborhood. And that often comes with gentrification, right? I want a nice wine bar and a cute bodega, the one with the nice shit in the bodega, you know what I mean? And it's like,
Cappuccino.
being like, what are we, and then the question I think always is, what are we willing to sacrifice? And then how do we move through? I keep quoting June Jordan, and I don't know if June Jordan said this, and I think Darnell could probably help me on this quote, but she talked about working within predominantly white institutions as almost like being like an eel. Like you move through slippery, you don't let anything get on you, but you're in it. You're in it, but you're not of it. And I think about that a lot. I think about that in terms of the institutions that I'm, you know, I was gonna say fortunate enough, that are fortunate enough to have me, and how I funnel resources or how I think about what I'm doing in that space is not, like my identity is not tied to that space. I work there to do other work, to do other things. And while I'm in the space of that larger campus structure or institutional structure, I'm creating these pockets of community. So for example, I was on this panel last weekend. It was for the 50th anniversary of the African American Cultural Center at Yale. And to see these women and men who had, at 19 years old in the late 60s, said, I need Black studies here at this Ivy League institution. And to know that they had the right to say that. You know what I mean? To not be afraid to think like, I'm barely here, how did I get here, and I might be thrown out. But to know that that was a right, that they were creating not just a community for themselves, but a sustainable, generational access to knowledge, right? And creating a political space that would extend far beyond themselves. And I was sitting next to one of my colleagues who's a dear friend, and she said something that I found like really, really powerful. It was very simple, but I want to carry it forward. One of the questions from the audience was about, you know, her classroom and how she teaches. And she said, well, I teach the Black students. And she was like, I teach the Black students. And everybody will get what, well, she didn't say everybody will get what they need, I added that. But like, I teach the Black students, basically, you know, and like, I think about all the classrooms that I've been in where people weren't teaching to me or talking to me, right? But I had to figure it out. But that's a way of creating these pockets of community in every space that you occupy. And I think we have to be really honest, and I think sometimes we can also let ourselves off the hook. Like, yeah, I'm at Yale, but I'm not really, you know, I'm doing radical work. Are you really though? And you know, you might not be doing radical work there. Maybe you're doing it somewhere else, or, you know, but you have to understand that that access comes with a lot of privilege. Even if you are a bald-headed, brown-skinned Black woman, right? There's a lot, if I say I'm a professor at Yale, the conversation changes. My access changes. When I send an email from that email address, I give my family a different sort of access. And so I think part of the conversation around creating community and thinking about whose neck you're standing on is also how you use that privilege to create more access for other folks. So it's not just sort of this like narcissistic, you know, woe is me, sort of existential crisis about my own privilege and power, but what are you doing with that, right? Instead of like denying it, how do you use it as a way to create different types of communities elsewhere?
And I'll just jump in about creating community, because creating Native Son was about standing on the shoulders, not the necks, of so many incredible Black, gay, or queer men like Bill T. Jones who were radical, who put themselves out there, who defied what they were supposed to do, right? They broke through glass ceilings and did things that were different and avant-garde and radical, and chose to put their lives on the line to do that work. And so then what could I give back, right? It's because that opened the doors for me to walk through, to be the editor-in-chief of Vibe, to win a National Magazine Award, to do all these things and have great privilege. And so for me, it turned into service, right? How do I give back to my community, and more importantly, the future generations that don't exist of young Black queer folks who are gonna come up and don't know their history, but will now have a North Star to look at, to know that they are still here.
And you know, you're more generous than I am in that regard, because my staff has famously heard me say this when I'm speaking to board member Catherine Stimson, artists are self-centered sons of bitches. You know, proudly, I say that, you know? And I remember downstairs, a very famous, very important EDI training with somebody who I think didn't have so much skill, but me, the staff, everybody's gonna let's get real. We're gonna talk management. We're gonna go horizontal. You know, everybody's gonna be able to talk back to, you know, and Bill T. Jones, you gotta hear, and I'm talking to some 23-year-old saying that to me, right? And I said, don't domesticate me. Now, you know, am I talking out of the right side of my mouth? Because community. I'm in this game. Why are you in this game? Because you are an angry, alienated son of a bitch who comes from a family of 12, and you had to find a way to talk in that family. Now the whole world becomes up. Some things have come out of it that are like the woman that read your book, that have a universality to it. Some things are hermetic, but I always think artists, that's the rule book for artists. There is no rule book. Now, there is no loyalty oath for artists. Now, this is why I'm going out on a limb here. I don't know, and my dear Kim, because we talk about this a lot, she's very much a community person. I don't know. What do you think you work for a self-involved son of a bitch, Kim? You know, and as I don't know what I'm saying here other than there is no rule book about artists. There's a man right here. I think I recognize him.
This will be our last question because we're a little over time.
Are we over time?
Yeah, we could go on forever and forever. Two more questions. Two more questions. Okay, cool. Thank you. Bjorn,
yeah, the gentleman's been there for a while.
Okay.
This is very brief. Thank you very much to the panel. Can everyone hear me? Do I sound muffled through the? Okay, great. So I want to just return briefly to what you said, Mr. Jones, earlier at the very beginning of the panel discussion when you talked about this characterization that was given you of being, widely written about. And I believe I sort of contributed to that to a certain extent because I've written about you for several years. You and I were in conversation over the pandemic. I'm Nicholas Boston, and I created the altered book based on Continuous Replay, the photographs of Arnie Zane, which I'd written about in 2004, the exhibition at the Paul Cooper Gallery for Gay City News, and then also wrote about the conversation that you had with Marlon James right before the pandemic hit. Now, you were very kind in saying that you and Mr. Amelin had been, self-isolating, obviously because of the pandemic, as we all were, and you had requested that I send you the book, and I thought, well, I will digitize it, and it's taken me 2 years to do that. So I'm here to tell you that it is digitized. I will send you the link, and I very much look forward to having a conversation with you about the book and and how, my point is how this mass media, how it goes from mass, or it can go from mass to individual and personal and intimate and a one-on-one conversation, which is very much what it was intended to be, and what I was thinking of as I went through its creation. So I just wanted to share that with you.
Well, thank you very much. We're honored to have you here. Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Yeah. Bjorn, did you want to speak? Did you want a question?
The next question's online, and then.
Oh, yes. I forgot there was online.
Yes, we have a question from Roxy from Ireland. According to you, in which ways can radical art serve the Black community nowadays?
According to me.
All of you.
How can it serve the Black community? I would like to show an example of a well-cultivated mind, reading. I would like to show the example of a brave person who is investigating life, and I do it through form. I'd like to be an example of how I can fold in my mother's prayers with my ideas about indeterminacy as taught by John Cage. That is how I serve the Black community, by performing those tasks and trying to solve those questions.
Wow.
That's a big one.
Was there another question, or is one more? Okay. We can hear you.
Okay. I think that my immediate jumping up after what Bill said a few minutes ago was a response that might now have a little lost its relevancy, but I think that it's nonetheless very important when you speak, Bill, and everything that you say, and this is something that we talk about in our intimacy, that we differentiate the artist from the art in the sense of the personal son of a bitch. This is a quote.
Self-involved son of a bitch.
Yes. Mm-hmm. Has nothing to do with the art that you do.
Oh, you think not?
It may have, for the psychologist who is analyzing your art and its relation to your personality, something to do. But it has nothing to do for the audience who is looking at your art.
It has nothing to do with the audience looking at the art?
No. And I think that as a result of that, when you say, why would your executive director work for a self-involved son of a bitch? She's not working for the self-involved son of a bitch. She's working for the artist, Bill T. Jones, and for the art that this artist is making. And I think that that differentiation is essential.
Kim, do you want to jump in?
I said, isn't it nice to have two men tell me what I'm working on?
Now, Kim, that was some sort of, Kim, was that a comment, a deflection? What was that?
Intervention.
An intervention.
An intervention, yes.
Do you want the mic, Kim?
Well, but Bjorn, do you understand how important it is? My community of scholars here has been, they got my back, right? And I am trying to, how can I be honest and fierce? How can I be world-loving and ambitious? How can I succeed in a world where most people who come into this world will not succeed? So I think it does, people can sense this conflict when they see the work, you know? And artists, you know, in the way we almost can't control how the work is received in the world. And as you maybe know, I think we know, one of the things that the critics in the 1970s and 80s were pointing at my generation and saying that we were utilitarian. And that was a bad thing, because your work is, you might as well be doing social work. Because the artist is actually working on some, here's a big word, Apollonian level. Now, is that disconnected? Is that disconnected? I thought that that's what gives you that buoyancy. that you can, because you are, and so I hear what you're saying, but I think all those things are like a loop of some sort, back and forth about how I feel about me and how I feel about the work that I make. And I've made my peace with it. No, I haven't made my peace with it. No.
I was about to say.
No. But that's a dynamo. That's a dynamo.
Bill, do you want to have the last word? I know you just said some words, but do you want to sort of seal us up for now?
No.
No. Okay. Good. That's a perfect answer. Can we thank this panel? Thank you for being here. Thank you for the conversation. Thank you all so much.
Thank you also to Kathleen and Candace, our wonderful ASL interpreters.
Thank you.